Good evening, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020, and tonight I'm continuing my reading of selected chapters and sections from Edwin Black's book called The War Against the Weak. And it's the story of how eugenics came to be and how it is America and the elites of Wall Street and our academic institutions that are the real authors of eugenics, and it's a race-based culling system to try to improve the general quality of human beings, to create, in other words, a master race before anyone ever heard of Adolf Hitler. Say good evening to everyone. David Underdown. Corky, hi Kathy. Thank you for your great wrench service as always, and thank you for your note today. Michael Lorette is here. Great. You listened to 7 hours. Oh my God. I couldn't listen to it. I'm glad. Thank you for your report, Michael. I'm glad to see that you have it there. I don't know what to say about, what William Barr recently said today that was quoted all over the mainstream press, that the Justice Department did not see anything that would overturn the results of the election. It's a horrific statement, and it's right now we know that it's either Trump or Barr, unless they've been working together all along, and it's just hopeless, collusion. But, here at McDuff Channel, we assume the best. We assume the president is acting in the best interest of the American people, and we assume that William Barr is who he is. We've studied him very carefully. We know he has a distinct history of being a deep state cover-up functionary, someone whose ancestry ties him to the British importing of people from Central Eastern Europe to act as agents, as sleeper agents for British intelligence. I can't prove that's who he is, but there's so much circumstantial evidence surrounding him and his father, Donald P. Barr, that was the headmaster of that Dalton school in Manhattan, where Jeffrey Epstein was hired as a math teacher, and all kinds of complaints were made about Dalton school. All these connections that we've made, and of course we must mention the work of all the other great researchers like Mark Kulak, Bill Taylor, and many people have contributed. The Mobster have contributed to our work. I did some genealogical work on Barr and try to verify whether that's really a British family, or is it one of those names that just kind of got changed from a prior Eastern European name, like Boer to Barr, for instance. Well, tonight we know that Barr is not on Trump's side. It's absolutely clear. So thank goodness we're moving along. He's gotten rid of some of the swamp cats, but he's still burdened with Barr. This means that there's blackmail. There's people have got stuff on Trump, and Trump has stuff on other people. It's just like J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles, and these people work by having dossiers and files on people. I do believe that President Trump still has this in hand. I'm wishing that he had a more well, look, all I can say is they're doing absolutely the best that they can. And it's, from what you say, Michael, they've exposed a great deal today in the testimony that they've been taking at these hearings, especially in Michigan and Arizona. But without the Attorney General on your side, you have really got a tough case to make. So Trump, you know, you may know, you probably know a lot more than I do, but for my sake, maybe we could finally get rid of this deep state cover-up functionary from our Justice Department. Well, that's just my opinion. Yeah, unleash the kulak. I think so. I like that. We are going to win this, and give me liberty or give me death. I love it. Willie, fix it. You are right. And I hope that the idea is not to create a permanent rift. Now, this attorney named Lynn something, was it Lynn Wood or something? I can't remember his name, but he surfaced into my radar screen a couple of days ago. He's representing Trump, I think, in Georgia. And did you see where he said that the country is headed toward a civil war and that President Trump should declare what he calls limited martial law? I'd be amazed if President Trump called for martial law, unless there really is some incredible swamp clearing operations going on that are going to be almost biblical in nature. You know, the kids in cages and the underground tunnels and the whole thing coming out. You know, a huge production of evil displayed for everyone to see it. It's what we need. We need this stuff to be exposed. But again, you don't get as high as President Trump has gotten in this world without somebody having something on you. So this is what I'm concerned with now, is that who's got the upper hand? The president or the attorney general? You say McInerney also said martial laws. Well, and have you seen those things about how they've set up a direct communication system to everybody's radios and TVs and internet, so that if they ever pull the plug on all of our communications, they will have their own single from the president pipeline of communication directly to everybody. That's creepy too, because, you know, as much as I dislike the mainstream media, I don't want to go to the extreme of censorship, which is what they're doing, you know. I'd rather just have the United States government publish the truth, because I do think that the truth always wins once people are aware of it. Lynn is not representing Trump officially. That's good. Thank you, Kathy. All right. Well, tonight, Eugenic Imperialism, and thank you for being with me as we ride through these dark passages of history, because when you consider the idea of these lockdowns and COVID and the obvious likelihood that if we stay locked down, we're going to start losing not only people and lives, older people especially, but also our economy itself, the very nuts and bolts of how America makes a living. And that'll make us sick as a country. Well, I do believe that it's very important that we understand this incredible movement toward eugenics that was started in the 1800s and became the darling project of our great corporations like the Standard Oil and the Harriman and Brown Brothers Harriman and the railroads, the oil companies, and that in cooperation with the foundations set up under Rockefeller and Ford, those foundations then insinuated themselves with money, of course, into the institutions that we think of as the greatest in the world for higher education, such as Harvard, Princeton, Dartmouth, Yale, Stanford, Chicago. And they taught the kids to follow this stuff. And who is the prize pupil is Henry Kissinger. So is he now, from his elevated ivory tower, wherever that is, directing the use of biological weapons to cull the population of the world, to get rid of disfavored races, colors, religions, nationalities, in the name of what they call population science or genetics, but what we call it's eugenics. It's the same thing that was done by Francis Galton and Davenport and Spencer and all of these people that I have to call nutcases. And there's no question about it. That's the crazy thing. You know, you would think that our higher education institutions wouldn't yield to the foundation money and go along with this nonsense, but because, you know, they're not stupid people. But somehow they all got swept up in it. All right, let's read some. Eugenic Imperialism. This is chapter 12. American eugenicists saw mankind as a biological cesspool. Well, there it is right there. You know, humanity is a cesspool, according to American eugenicists. There it is. After purifying America from within and preventing defective strains from reaching U.S. shores, they planned to eliminate undesirables from the rest of the planet. In 1911, the Eugenics section of the American Breeders' Association, in conjunction with the Carnegie Institution, began work upon its report of the Committee to Study and to Report on the Best Practical Means for cutting off the defective germplasm in the human population. The last of 18 points was entitled International Cooperation. It meant its intent was unmistakable. The Eugenics Records Office would undertake studies looking toward the possible application of the sterilization of defectives in foreign countries, together with records of any such operations. The American eugenics movement intended to turn its sights on the extent and nature of the problem of the socially inadequate in foreign countries. This would be accomplished by incessant international congresses, federations, and scientific exchanges. Global eugenics began in 1912 with the first International Congress of Eugenics in London. At that conference, the dominant American contingent presented its report on eliminating all social inadequates worldwide. Their blueprint for world eugenic action was overwhelmingly accepted, so much so that after the Congress, the Carnegie Institution published the study as a special two-part bulletin. International cooperation soon began to coalesce. That first Congress welcomed delegations from many countries, but 5 in particular sent major consultative committees: the United States, Germany, Belgium, Italy, and France. During the Congress, these few leaders constituted themselves as a so-called International Eugenics Committee. This new body first met a year later. On August 4, 1913, prominent eugenic leaders from the United States, England, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, and Norway converged on Paris. This new International Eugenics Oversight Committee would function under various names and in various member configurations as the Supreme International Eugenics Agency, deciding when and where congresses would be held, which national committees and institutions would be recognized, and which eugenic policies would be pursued. The dozen or so men scheduled a second planning session for 1 year later, August 15, 1914, in Belgium. They also scheduled the Second International Congress of Eugenics, which would be open to delegates from all nations and held in 1915 in New York City. But in August of 1914, Germany invaded Belgium. A continent-wide war ignited before Europe's eyes. The Belgian planning session was canceled and the Second International Congress was postponed. While Europe fought, and indeed after the United States entered the war, America continued its domestic eugenic programs and held its place as the world leader in eugenic research, theory, and activism. When the war ended 4 years later, international eugenics reorganized, with America retaining its leadership. The Second International Congress of Eugenics was rescheduled for September 1921, still in New York under the auspices of the Washington-based National Research Council, the administrative arm of America's prestigious, congressionally chartered National Academy of Sciences. The National Academy of Sciences functioned as a way of uniting America's disparate scientific establishments. As it had for its first Congress, the State Department mailed the invitations around the world. Although the National Research Council was the official authorizing body, Davenport wrote his colleagues that it was quote, up to the New York group to put this Congress through. The New York group was led by Laughlin, Mrs. Harriman, and Madison Grant, author of, quote, The Passing of the Great Race, unquote. In addition to being among the world's leading raceologists, Madison Grant was a trustee for the American Museum of Natural History. The museum became the titular sponsor of the Second Congress. The museum's premises were used for the Congress's meetings and exhibits. Its staff helped with the details, and its president, Henry Osborne, a eugenicist himself, was named president of the international gathering. The museum's name was prominently displayed on the published proceedings, as though the Congress were just another museum function. All of this imbued the event with a distinctly evolutionary and anthropological quality. This was exactly the intent of Congress organizers. They wanted the event to be seen as a milestone in the natural history of the human species. The Second Congress was rich with typical raceological dogma and dominated by American biological precepts. Alexander Graham Bell assumed the honorary presidency. The proceedings were divided into 4 sections: comparative heredity, the human family, racial differences, and, quote, eugenics and the state, unquote. Delegates from every continent attended Delegates from every continent attended to share eugenic principles and to form legislative game plans that they could take back home. Osborne's opening address represented a challenge from America. In certain parts of Europe, he set forth, the worst elements of society have gained the ascendancy and threatened the destruction of the best. He recognized that, quote, to each of the countries of the world, racial betterment presents a different aspect. Let each consider its own problems. But in the final analysis, it came down to one mandate, quote, as science has enlightened government in the prevention and spread of disease, it must also enlighten government in the prevention of the spread and multiplication of worthless members of society. Osborne also repeated the standard eugenic idea, quote, the true spirit of American democracy, that all men are born with equal rights and duties, has been confused with the political sophistry that all men are born with equal character and ability to govern themselves, unquote. Not only was the rhetoric American, but so was the science. Out of 53 scientific papers, all but 12 were produced by American eugenicists on American issues, all conforming to the Carnegie Institution's socio-political strategies. Topics included Indiana's Tribe of Ishmael, Kentucky's Mountain People, and Lucian Howe's Proposals on Hereditary Blindness. Some European eugenicists complained about America's domination of the Global Congress. Sweden's Herman Lundborg, for example, railed to Davenport in a rambling handwritten missive that America was trying to hijack the worldwide movement. I've been hoodwinked. By what right do you in America usurp the words Second International, when the Congress is not international? It is an injustice which not only I, but I believe the majority of my Swedish section do not approve of. Such protests did not deter Davenport and his colleagues. Indeed, in a special presentation on the essence of eugenic research, Davenport explained his dedication. Why do we investigate? He asked. Alas, we have now too little precise knowledge in any field of eugenics. We can command respect for our eugenic conclusions only as our findings are based on rigid proof. Davenport reminded the delegates that wealthy American benefactors had made the critical difference between mere ideas and hard data. It is largely due to the extraordinary vision of Mrs. E. H. Harriman, the founder of the Eugenics Record Office, that in this country eugenics is more a subject of research than mere propaganda. Money made the difference. For the International Convention as well, Mrs. Harriman donated an extra $2,500 to fund the more than 120 exhibits erected throughout the museum. These included a prominent exhibit on sterilization statutes in the United States. The Carnegie Institution extended a special grant of $2,000 to defray travel expenses for several of the key European speakers and to cover general expenses for the delegates. Other wealthy eugenicists contributed significant sums and were named patrons of the gathering. They included sanitarium owner John Kellogg, working through his Race Betterment Foundation, and YMCA benefactor and prominent political contributor Cleveland H. Dodge. In recalling the Congress some weeks later for the Indiana Academy of Science, Carnegie researcher Arthur Estabrook quoted Osborne, quote, that all men are born with equal rights and duties has been confused with the political sophistry that all men are born with equal character and ability to govern themselves, unquote. During the Congress, Davenport orchestrated the renaming and broadening of the International Eugenics Committee into a permanent International Commission on Eugenics. This renamed entity would sanction all eugenic organizations in cooperating member countries, which now included Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Germany was not included because it refused to sit on the same panel with its World War I enemies, Belgium and France. Germany was also struggling under the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which made international eugenic cooperation difficult. Multinational eugenics gathered momentum during the next 2 years. In October 1922, the Permanent International Commission assembled in Brussels. The meeting was once again steered by Davenport and his circle. Representatives from Belgium, Denmark, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Norway began coordinating their efforts. The Commission resolved to learn more about the eugenics campaigns in India and Japan, and also voted unanimously to invite Germany back into its ranks. In September of 23, Lachlan kicked off his first European immigration tour by attending the Permanent International Commission meeting in Lund, Sweden. Preparations for this meeting prevented Lachlan from sailing to Europe in July with Secretary of Labor James Davis. At the Lund meeting, Lachlan advanced most of the motions that the Commission adopted. The 1923 meeting proved a watershed event for the movement. The group ratified the 4-point ultimate program devised by the American Eugenics Society, calling for each nation to undertake research, education, administrative measures, and conservative legislation within its borders. To keep the Eugenic Directorate truly elite, Commission rules permitted no more than 3 representatives of each cooperating country. Davenport and Lachlan sat at the apex of this group. All Commission members were dedicated to the American espoused belief in Nordic supremacy, a sentiment which was also growing in Germany. Yet Germany was still not a full participant in the Commission. Although Germany was willing to rejoin the group, German race scientists told commissioners that Germany still could not cooperate with representatives of certain nations. In personal correspondence, German eugenicists specified what they meant: the French. Commission leaders said they would wait. With Germany still in the periphery, Davenport and Lachlan were able to extend U.S. domination of the Commission's scope, science, and political agenda. Resolutions were binding on the dozen or so members, committing them to pursue the agreed-upon legislation and scientific strategies. Because of this, policy developed on Long Island leapt across the ocean directly into the capitals of other nations. For example, in 1925, Davenport introduced a resolution based on Lachlan's strategy of investigating immigrant families and screening them for eugenical fitness. Likening human beings to farm animals, Davenport's resolution read, "Whereas every nation has a right to select those who shall be included in its body politic, and whereas some knowledge of both family history and past personal performance are as essential a part of the information about a human immigrant and potential parent as about an imported horse or cow, therefore be it resolved that each immigrant receiving country may properly inquire into the family and personal history of each immigrant." Worldwide uniformity was important to Davenport. To push usage of the ERO's standard family pedigree form in all countries, Davenport issued a message. Members are reminded that a standardization form of pedigree was worked out by the Federation and has been widely published in most countries. By 1925, the Commission was comprised not just of individuals, but also of constituent eugenic societies and institutions. Hence it was time to adopt another new name, the International Federation of Eugenic Organizations, IFEO. To endeavor to secure some measure of uniformity in the methods of research and also sufficient uniformity in the form of presentation of results to make international work of worldwide use, to endeavor to promote measures tending to eugenic progress, whether international or national, on comparable lines. Even though Davenport was an influential force, Federation members were independent thinkers. They advanced their own substantial legislative and scientific contributions for consideration by the Federation. The Nordic countries of Scandinavia were especially active in this regard. Indeed, Europe's northwestern nations were the most receptive to eugenics. Predominantly Catholic countries were the most resistant. Whether resistant or receptive, however, each country's eugenics movement developed in its own literature, in its own language, its own racial and genetic societies, its own raciology personalities, and its own homegrown agendas. Nonetheless, the movement's fundamental principles were American and shepherded by Americans. Many foreign eugenicists traveled to America for training at Cold Spring Harbor and to attend meetings, congresses, and conferences. At the epicenter of eugenics and by virtue of its domination of the IFEO, American eugenic imperialism was able to take root throughout Europe and indeed the world. Belgium's Société Belge d'Eugenique was organized in 1919. The Belgian Eugenics Society announced in Eugenical News that it was fully awake to the needs of the time in connection with preservation of the race. Its leaders realized that the safeguarding of public health through hygienic measures is not sufficient, but that due attention must be paid to the prevention of the transmission of hereditary traits that would be injurious to the race. The new society's 9 sections included one for social hygiene, documentation, and legislation. Within 2 years, the Belgian Eugenics Society launched its own, which the ERO at Cold Spring Harbor quickly declared to be of the highest order. Dr. Albert Govaerts led the Belgian movement. He was allied with Lachlan from the beginning. Govaerts stayed on after the International Congress in 1921, traveled to Cold Spring Harbor for a term of study which was funded from America's Post-War Commission for Relief in Belgium Educational Foundation. Govaerts' work at the ERO concentrated on hereditary tuberculosis studies. After Govaerts returned to Belgium, his original tables and calculations remained on file at the ERO. By early 1922, Govaerts' Belgian Society had installed eugenic lectures and courses at the University of Brussels. They also succeeded in garnering recognition of the budding science from the Belgian government. Later in 1922, a government-supported National Office of Eugenics opened in Brussels at the distinguished Solvay Institute. The National Office of Eugenics trained eugenic field workers and operated as a Belgian version of the ERO. In Canada, eugenic passions became inflamed over many issues, including the birth rate of French Canadians. But perhaps no debate was more heated than the one prompted by problems associated with immigrant groups. Hard-working Asian and European immigrants flowed into Canada throughout the 1890s as the country's infrastructure expanded. In 1905, Ontario carried out its first census of the feeble-minded. Shortly after Indiana passed its 1907 sterilization law, Ontario's provincial inspector of hospitals argued that Rantoul's concepts could end the hereditary production of tramps, prostitutes, and other immoral characters. Another Canadian physician pointed to the example of a Chicago doctor who advocated asexualization. Now that's a word I've never seen before, asexualization, to take away your sexuality entirely. Don't you think sometimes that's where they're headed with this when they're trying to make all these 28 some different types of sexual orientations, that really they're turning it into something that is not natural. And in my opinion, what they're trying to do is to turn us all into identical, interchangeable servants. In Switzerland, the eminent psychiatrist and sexologist Dr. Auguste Forel was a leading disciple of eugenics beginning in 1910. He was also a proponent of U.S.-style sterilization laws. The wealthy industrialist Julius Claus, that's Klaus, was another early advocate, endorsing eugenic registers to identify Switzerland's unfit. When he died in 1920, he bequeathed more than 1 million Swiss francs, or about $4.4 million in modern money, to establish a fund for Swiss eugenics investigations and related advocacy. Claus's will specifically forbade using the fund for charitable works to ameliorate the condition of physical and mental defectives, unquote. Swiss eugenic scientists were suddenly endowed. The anthropologist Otto Schlagenhofen became director of the Zurich-based Julius Claus Foundation for Heredity Research, Social Anthropology, and Racial Hygiene, as well as the Institution for Race Biology. These organizations were dedicated to the promotion of all scientifically based efforts whose ultimate goal is to improve the white race, unquote. In 1923, Schlagenhofen and Forel, now fully funded, ascended to the Permanent International Eugenics Commission. Swiss eugenics focused on the exclusion of certain ethnic groups, as well as Forel's notion of sexology, that is, the study of sexual behavior, especially as it related to women. Forel believed women wished to be and should be conquered, mastered, and subjugated, quote unquote, to fulfill their national reproductive duty. In 1928, Switzerland's first sterilization law was passed in Canton Vaud, where Forel practiced. It targeted a vaguely defined unfit. Only Vaud passed such a law, but physicians across the country performed sterilizations for both medical and eugenical reasons. Although the extent of Swiss sterilizations remains unknown, one scholar ascertained that some 90% of the operations were conducted on women. In Denmark, eugenics were organized by two of Davenport's earliest Confederates, August Wimmer and Søren Hansen. Wimmer was a psychiatrist at the University of Copenhagen, and Hansen was president of the Danish Anthropological Committee. As Nordic raceologists seeking to stamp out defective strains within an already eugenically elite country, their affiliation with Davenport was natural. One Danish physician even traveled to the Vineland Training School in New Jersey to study under H. Goddard, whose texts on the coeliacs and revision of the Binet-Simon test became standard in Danish eugenical publications. Although resistant at first, in 1912 the government launched a massive eugenical registration of deaf mutes, the feeble-minded, and other defectives. It was not until a decade later that the first eugenic marriage restriction law was adopted. So-called therapeutic sterilization was common, but compulsory sterilization would not be legalized until 1929. A government commission re-examined the sterilization issue in 1926, looking to America for guidance. Lachlan arranged for his lengthy legislative guide on sterilization to be sent by Chicago Judge Harry Olsen directly to a member of the Danish Sterilization Commission. Shortly after the passage of Denmark's legislation, the Rockefeller Foundation began supporting eugenic research in that country. Denmark's leading eugenic scientist, Dr. Tage Kemp, received much of the financial support. The first grants were awarded in 1930 for blood group research. The next year, Kemp received a special Rockefeller Fellowship to continue his research. In 1932, Kemp traveled to Cold Spring Harbor for further study. He wanted eugenic and genetic research to achieve greater scientific and medical exactitude. I was notably impressed by the importance of the careful execution of the several observations, he wrote Rockefeller officials, adding, "These ought as far as possible to be carried out and re-examined by an investigator with medical education." Rockefeller officials agreed, granting Kemp a second fellowship in 1934. They would continue to fund race biology and human genetics in Denmark throughout the 1930s. Kemp was among the new breed of eugenic geneticists the Rockefeller Foundation was cultivating to lift eugenics out of a mere racial rhetoric and into the realm of unemotional science. A Rockefeller report explained their confidence in Kemp. Quote, "Race biology today suffers immensely from its mixture with political dogmas and drives. Dr. Kemp, through his personality and training, is as free from these as possible." In Norway, the raceologist John Alfred Muren endorsed American eugenics from the outset. He propounded his theories from a well-equipped animal and human measurement lab, as well as a grand personal library crammed floor to ceiling with books and files. At the Second Congress in New York, Muren suggested the resolution that ultimately led to the formation of the American Eugenics Society. In his opening address to the convention, Osborne singled out Muren and Lundborg. It is largely through the active efforts of leaders like Muren and Lundborg, he acknowledged, that there is a new appreciation of the spiritual, moral, and physical value of the Nordic race. Davenport toured eugenic facilities in Norway, and Muren visited New York on several occasions. Muren was also a frequent contributor to and a topic of eugenical news. The dapper Norwegian was often pictured arm in arm with leading American eugenicists such as Leon Whitney. Norway passed its sterilization law in 1934, and in 1977 amended it to become a mostly voluntary measure. Some 41,000 operations were performed, about 75% of them on women. The Swedish government's State Institute on Race Biology opened its doors in 1922. It was an entire school dedicated to eugenic thought, and it would leave a multi-layered movement in its wake. Sweden alternately shared and coordinated its programs with the IFEO. Sweden's first sterilization law was passed in 1934. It began by sterilizing those who had, quote, mental illness, feeble-mindedness, or other mental defects, and eventually widened its scope to include those with an antisocial way of life. Eventually, some 63,000 government-approved sterilizations were undertaken on a range of unfit, quote-unquote, individuals, mainly women. In some years, women represented a mere 63% of those sterilized, but in most years, the percentage who were women exceeded 90%. American influence rolled across the continent. Finland, Hungary, France, Romania, Italy, and other European nations developed American-style eugenics movements that echoed the agenda and methodology of the font at Cold Spring Harbor. Soon, the European movements learned to cloak their work in more medically and scientifically refined approaches, and many were eventually funded by such philanthropic sponsors as the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Carnegie Institution. In the late 20s and 30s, these foundations liberally granted money to studies that adhered to a more polished clinical regimen. Throughout the 20s and 30s, America's views were celebrated at the numerous international gatherings held in America, such as the Third International Congress of Eugenics, which in 1932 was hosted once again at New York City's American Museum of Natural History. Theory became doctrine when proliferated in the many eugenic newsletters, books, and journals published by the American movement. America's most venerable, sorry, there's a Freudian slip, America's most venerable universities and academic authorities also reinforced the view that eugenic science was legitimate. Some nations, such as France and Italy, rejected their native eugenic movements. Some, such as Holland, only enacted broadly based registration laws. Some, such as Lithuania and Brazil, enacted eugenic marriage laws. Some, such as Finland, went as far as forced sterilization. One nation, Germany, would go farther than anyone could imagine. Well, I'll tell you the name of the next chapter is Eugenicide, and you know what that means. So there you have it. It's an American movement. It's been pushed by American elites, Harriman, Rockefeller, Carnegie, these so-called charitable institutions are spending all their money on propaganda and trying to find some studies that'll support their conclusions, knowing really that there's no science underneath of what they're saying, except for these, the front guys like Davenport and Laughlin who actually believe this stuff because they're not real bright. Well, it's incredible, but that's the mindset of American elites. And that's why Wall Street financed the Nazis. That's why Wall Street financed Hitler. Because they believe in the master race. This is not something that just came into being in Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles and the hardships that it imposed upon the German people. This is not a visceral reaction of the German folk to losing World War I. No, this is a sponsored, imposed agenda couched in medical and academic terms that leads directly to the Holocaust. And though they lost the war, they didn't disappear. They've been in their laboratories and they've been strengthening their propaganda, and they've been working with people like Bill Gates, people like Soros, people like David Rockefeller, people like a certain prince of a certain watery kingdom across the ocean, whose first name starts with C. But I won't mention it, because if I do, it's termination time. That's propaganda. That's censorship. That's power. And that is not science. You know, this is the kind of thing, you know, Macduff would call it just a bunch of horse shit. But look what they did with it. Look what they've done. Okay, thanks for being with me tonight. Tomorrow night, I'm looking forward to reopening the great book by Jonathan Whitney called The Crimes of Patriots. And I will attempt to do my best to summarize it all within 1 hour for you tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Have a great evening. Thanks for being with me. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you tomorrow.